Yeah, we are having a very interesting question now. You will really enjoy solving this question. It says that lessee enters into a 10-year lease for 2000 square meters of office space. The annual lease payments are rupees 1 lakh payable at the end of each year. The interest rate implicit in the lease cannot be readily determined. Lessor's incremental borrowing rate at the commencement date is 6% per annum. If you are following the questions well, you will realize that this first portion of the question is absolutely the same as the earlier question. And hence I will pick up my answers from the earlier question only. See, once again, it is a 10-year lease, right? So it's a 10-year lease. Once again, the lease rent is 1 lakh. And once again, the discount rate is 6%. So that was a similar situation even in the earlier question. So what we had done in the earlier question is, here it is, the answer for the earlier question. We had picked up the initial lease liability as 7,36,000. Of course, that 7,36,000 was also from one of the earlier questions. But we will pick up 436. Or if you want the original earlier question, then here it is. Yes, here it is. The original earlier question. 10 years, 1 lakh, 6%, 7,36,000. So in this question also, your initial lease liability shall be 7,36,000. So from earlier question, we are going to pick up 7,36,000. Okay. It is right now a 10-year lease. Okay. Then they say at the beginning of year 5, at the beginning of year 6, it is as good as end of year 5. Lessee and the lessor agree to amend the original lease to include an additional 1500 square meters. You will include an additional 1500 square meters. That means the scope of the lease is increasing. You are increasing the scope of the lease in the same building starting from the beginning of year 6, and two things are happening. See, and reduce the lease term from 10 years to 8 years. On one hand, you are increasing the scope of the lease, and on another hand, you are decreasing the lease term. They are saying we will reduce the lease term from 10 years to 8 years. Okay. This is happening at the beginning of year 6. So that means it is the end of the 5th year. So 5 years have already got completed. In other words, as far as the original lease is considered, 5 years are left. Isn't it? In the original lease, 5 years are left. And now they are saying that no, we want to curtail it to 8 years. We want to curtail it to 8 years. Now 5 years have already gone by. If I want to curtail it to 8 years, that means from that logic, 3 years are left. Original lease term is 10 years. 5 years have already got completed. That means as far as the original lease is considered, 5 years are left. Now we are saying that no, originally it was 10, but from original 10 I want to make it as 8. Out of 8, 5 years have already got completed. That means the revised lease term is 3 years. So we are doing two things simultaneously. The first thing is we are increasing the scope by adding 1500 square meters of additional space, and we are reducing the lease term from 10 years to 8 years. Okay. Now they are saying that the annual fixed payment for 3500 square meters is 1,50,000 payable at the end of each year. So earlier you were paying 1 lakh, now you will pay 1,50,000. That means for the additional space you are paying 50,000 rupees extra. Now whenever the scope is increasing, be careful. Increase in the scope of the lease can result into that being treated as a separate lease agreement. But it becomes a separate lease agreement if the lease consideration is increasing commensurate to the standalone price. Now we will have to check whether any such information is there in this question or not. Okay. So they say it is 1,50,000 payable at the end of each year from year 6 to year 8. Fine. Less's incremental borrowing rate at the beginning of the year 6 is 7%. So you are changing the Discount rate, originally it was 6%, now it will become 7%. Now, the consideration for the increase in the scope of 1500 square meters of space, important, not commensurate with the standalone price. It is not commensurate. If they had used the word it is commensurate, then the modification of the increase in the scope of the lease shall be treated as a separate lease. But here it will not be treated as a separate lease. Separate lease, when does that happen? Two things should happen. When can we say it is a separate lease? Two things should happen. First, scope of the lease should be increasing, which is happening in this particular case. And second condition, the lease consideration should be increasing commensurate to the standalone price. Here they are clarifying it is not commensurate with the standalone price. In other words, it is the original lease only that has to be modified. The accounting of the modification will affect your existing lease. Standalone price for that increase adjusted to reflect the circumstances of the contract. Fine. Consequently, lessee does not account for the increase in the scope that adds the right to use an additional 1500 square meters of space as a separate lease. They are themselves saying that we will not account it as a separate lease. If this statement was not there, still our conclusion would have been the same. They are saying, how should the said modification be accounted for? Okay. Before we do the accounting for the modification, we will require certain figures for our existing lease, isn't it? So we know that we have to first calculate the initial lease liability, which we will pick up from the earlier question, which we know is 7,36,000. Then on the date of modification, what exactly is the carrying amount of the original lease liability? That will be required. So these are two calculations that we have to initially do for our original lease. Yes. Fine. So what we do is we carry out those calculations first. These figures we have to simply pick up from the earlier calculations. We will simply show them. We will say measurement of initial lease liability. We know it is 7,36,000. We say from earlier question, right? Next, I require carrying amount of original lease liability on date of modification, that is beginning of 6th year, that is end of 5th year. It will be 4,21,225. Again, from earlier question. I'll show you that. This was the working that we had done in the earlier question. So here is the 5th year, right? And here is that amount, 421,225. This is the original amount. See, 7,36,000. We started the lease liability repayment schedule with 7,36,000 and we reached up to 4,21,225. So for the original lease, this is the balance. Originally you had 2,000 square meters, and for this 2,000 square meters your liability is 4,21,225. Now what we are doing is we are going for additional 1,500 square meters, and for that additional 1,500 square meters additional lease rent will be payable. So we want to know what shall be the additional lease liability. Say measurement of additional lease liability, say for 1500 square meters. Here these payments. Now the discount rate has become 7%. If you wish, you can be more elaborate. You can say in the earlier one, you are saying carrying amount of original lease liability, and then you may write in brackets, you can say for 2000 square meters. Your original lease liability is for 2000 square meters. This calculation that we are doing is for the additional 1500 square meters. Your lease term now is 8 years. 5 years have already got completed. So 3 years are left. 3 years are left. So this calculation I will be doing for 3 years. What is the additional lease rent that we will have to pay? Okay. You see the question. The original lease rent is 1 lakh for 2000 square meters. Now you have another 1500. So 2000 plus 1500, you now have 3500 square meters. And for that you will pay 1 lakh 50. So for 2000, 1 lakh, and for 3500, 1 lakh 50. That means for the additional 1500 square meters, you are paying additional 50,000 rupees. So 50,000 needs to be considered over here. You can elaborate if you wish. 1 lakh 50 minus 1 lakh. .624 cumulative present value factor. $131,200. So the scope of the lease is increasing by 1500 square meters. So because of that, your lease liability will increase by 1,31,200, and so will your ROU asset. See, ROU asset right now is for 2000 square meters. Now I have to reflect it for 3500 square meters. So I should increase it by 131,200. Your lease liability right now is for 2000 square meters. Now it should be for 3500 square meters. So I should increase it by 131,200, isn't it? So your accounting entry over here shall be ROU asset account debit 131,200 to lease liability account. I am increasing it for the additional 1500 square meters. 1,31,000. If you are still writing, just pause the video here and complete. Now understand one thing. You have taken care of part A. Part A was additional 1500 square meters. We have taken care of it. Now we don't have to worry about this additional 1500 square meters. Additional 1500 square meters has increased our lease liability by 1,31,200, which we have already adjusted through the ROU asset. So effect of the first modification, which was increasing the scope of the lease, is already considered. Now whatever is left is only for the decrease in the lease term. Lease term has decreased for the original 2000 square meters. So for that we have to now give the effect. Getting it? For that we have to now give the effect. Now this 4,21,225 that you are showing, I'm talking about this. You are showing 4,21,225. This is your lease liability on the date of modification, but for 2000 square meters. This 4,21,225 is based on the original lease term of 10 years. But now the lease liability should reflect the revised lease term of 8 years. So we have to now consider that. Okay. So for the years 6, 7 and 8, see, we are doing modification at the end of the 5th year. So for the year 6, 7 and 8 only, now you will pay a lakh of rupees of lease rent. And the discount rate has got updated from 6% to 7%. So we should find out what is going to be the revised, or we can say the modified lease liability reflecting the reduced lease term. So we will say over here, measurement of original lease liability. By original we mean 2000 square meters for reduced lease term. The rate is 7% now. All of our original calculations was for 10 years. Originally 5 years are left, but now only 3 years are left. So this calculation is for 3 years. For 2000 square meters, your lease rent is a lakh of rupees, and this we have already calculated 2.624. So this will be 262,400. I hope you are comfortable with the rationale of this calculation. Okay. We are saying that the original lease liability has a balance of 4,21,225. But that 421,225 is as per the original term of 10 years. Now the revised circumstances are that only 3 years are left. Okay. So we are simply arguing that if right from the very beginning the lease term was only 3 years, then what would have been the lease liability? We realize that the lease liability would have been 2,62,400. Now, similar adjustment also has to be made with the ROU asset. Our original ROU asset for 2000 square meters is 7,36,000. 5 years have already gone by. So for 5 years, you must have provided for the depreciation. So we will deduct that depreciation. Then we will get the carrying amount of the ROU asset for the remaining 5 years. But now we are not going to depreciate the ROU asset over the remaining 5 years. We will depreciate it over remaining only 3 years. So the balance of the ROU asset also needs to be adjusted. Again, I am repeating, all these calculations we are doing only for the original 2000 square meters. 1500 square meter already taken care of, right? It was the additional liability which we have already taken care of. We are now giving effect only for the reduction in the lease term. Okay. So what I do is I say determination of carrying amount of ROU asset for 2000. I am being as elaborate as possible, for 2000 square meters on date of modification. Okay, on date of modification. So we say initial ROU asset or original ROU asset, whatever you may say. We incorporated that at 7,36,000 less depreciation for 5 years. You can even pick up this figure also from the earlier calculations. 7,36,000, no salvage value. 10 years was original term into 5. We know it is 3,68,000. I get 3,68,000. So on the date of modification, we have 3,68,000. But this 3,68,000, understand the logic. This 3,68,000 is reflecting the ROU asset to be further depreciated over the remaining lease term of 5 years. But because of the lease modification, you do not have remaining 5 years. Because of lease modification, you have remaining 3 years. So this balance should be reflecting the revised lease term. So lease term is reduced from 10 years to 8 years. Full stop. Thus, above carrying amount shall be depreciated over remaining 3 years and not 5 years. You get my point? We were planning to depreciate the asset over 10 years. That is how we were providing for the depreciation. Our plan is that the remaining 3,68,000 should also be depreciated over the remaining lease term of 5 years. But now I don't have 5 years of remaining lease term. I have only 3 years of remaining lease term. So I should find out a balance which reflects this changed circumstances. So we say implies revised balance of ROU asset equals to 3,68,000, which we were planning to depreciate over 5 years. But now I need a balance which is equivalent to 3 years. 2,2800. You're just writing, then please pause the video here. Yes, so finally we have reached a stage where we can give the effect for the reduction in the lease term. So we say effect of reduction in lease term. If there is any gain or loss on reduction in the lease term, we have to recognize that in the profit and loss account. We will first start with the liability. We say lease liability on date of modification for 2,000 square meters for 10 years lease term. See, I'm trying to be as elaborate as possible. The reason is that after many days or many months, when you sit down for revision, it should be clear that why we are doing this. We are not talking about 1500 square meters at all. That is additional liability already incorporated. Okay, that's a separate issue which we have already settled. Now, what is the lease liability on the date of modification for the original 2000 for the original lease term of 10 years? We know it is 4,21,225. Less. We say lease liability for 2,000 square meters for 8 years lease term. If the lease term is 8 years, then how much it should be? How much it should be? Here it is. Just at the top, we have that calculation. Show you the heading. It is 2,62,400. So, $262,400. I get 1,58,825. Let's say reduction in lease liability. Call this as A. Reduction in lease liability, 1,58,825. Similar change is also there in the ROU asset. So, ROU asset on date of modification for 2,000 square meters for 10 years, right? 3,68,000. Less. ROU asset, of course, on the date of modification for 2,000 square meters for 8 years. We had calculated one revise, right? 220,800. 220,800. 220,800. You get 147,200. This is reduction in ROU asset. Let's call this as B. Liability is reducing by 1,58,825 and ROU asset is reducing by 1,47,200. There is a higher reduction in the liability. So we are having gain. Gain on reduction in lease term. A minus B. It's turning out to be 11,625. If you'll see the solution of the earlier question, see in the earlier question also, we are doing a similar calculation, the effect of the remeasurement of the lease liability. But before that, yes, here it is. See this one. I'm talking about this. The gain or loss. You know what was happening in the earlier question? we were directly getting the reduction in the lease liability directly. We were getting directly the reduction in the ROU asset. Right? Understand? Lease liability was 4,21,000 and we knew it has reduced by 50%. So I multiplied by 50%, I get reduction in the lease liability. So reduction in lease liability was available straight away. In this question also I have done the same thing only. Only thing is I have to do a working for reduction in the lease liability. Please understand. At the base level, the calculation is actually the same. You are comparing reduction in lease liability with reduction in the ROU asset. But in the earlier question, reduction in the lease liability was directly available. Here I had to do, here I had to do a working for the same. And then see, the end result is reduction in the lease liability, which was directly available in the earlier question. And then again, if you see the earlier question's answer, reduction in the ROU asset, see, reduction in the ROU asset was directly available. But in this question, I had to calculate that how much is the reduction in the ROU asset. And then eventually what you did, reduction in the lease liability, you compared with the reduction in the ROU asset, and then you calculated your gain or loss. At principal level, I am doing the same thing over here. First, I am calculating reduction in lease liability. Then I am calculating reduction in ROU asset, and then I am getting this gain. Right? Now I am getting this gain. Isn't it? So finally, to wrap it up, we can put our accounting entry. To wrap it up, accounting entry. Lease liability is reducing. So lease liability, account debit, 1,58,825. Asset is also reducing, so to ROU asset account, 147,200 to profit and loss account, 11,625. So that's the end of this particular question. I hope you really enjoyed solving it. If you are still writing, just pause the video here. You can forward the video if anything was left earlier to be written. We will stop over here.